Welcome back to the Reveal. We are in John chapter 18, and we ended last time in verse 7. Here's what's going on. The Jews, Caiaphas, the priest, the Pharisees, they've all brought Jesus to Pilate in order for Pilate to pronounce a crucifixion on him because they can't do it. And the last thing they said was, we have a law, and by that law he ought to die because he made himself out to be the Son of God. So Pilate has already whipped, he has already mocked, he has already put a crown of thorns and a purple robe over Jesus. He's already tried to humiliate him, but it's not enough. And when he takes him out there and shows Jesus and what he's done to him, they say, no, he needs to die. So in verse 8, therefore when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. He was more afraid because he knew he was going to be forced into crucifying this guy, and he didn't want to crucify him because he wouldn't be able to justify that to the Romans. Why did you put this guy to death? Oh, because they told me to. Well, that's not leadership for the Romans. So in verse 9, he was even more afraid, and he entered into the praetorium again, this is where Jesus is being held, and said to Jesus, where are you from? They're saying you're from God. But Jesus gave him no answer. Whew, something big's about to happen. So Pilate said to him, you do not speak to me? Do you not know that I have the authority to release you, and I have the authority to crucify you? Jesus gives an answer that means more than Pilate understood for sure. Jesus answered and said, you would have no authority over me unless it had been given you from above. And for this reason, he who delivered me to you has a greater sin. What did he just say to Pilate? He said, look, you don't have any authority over me at all unless God had given it to you. And God has predetermined this entire crucifixion route, so I know what's coming, even if you haven't decided it yet. But you're not really at the level of fault that the Jews are for saying that I'm not God and rejecting me and wanting me dead. So Pilate doesn't know what to do with this statement, but Jesus said, only God could give you authority over me. That's an interesting statement for us when we talk about our authority on earth. Then he goes on to say, the Jews are the ones that are fighting against God. Verse 12, as a result of this, Pilate made efforts to release him. Pilate does not want to crucify him. He can't find a justifiable reason. He can get in trouble with his own Roman folks for doing it, with his leadership. It's a Jewish thing. He just wants the Jews to go handle it. But the Jews cried out saying, if you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar. What are they doing now? They've just shifted their strategy a little bit. Now they're coming after Pilate, and they're saying, you want to see an uprising in this city? We'll tell Caesar that you're no friend of Caesar because you won't do the right thing here. We'll create a stink that you'll have to deal with. And then they say, everybody who makes himself out to be king, you're even calling him the king of the Jews. If he's a king of the Jews, then he's opposed to Caesar. They're just finding arguments to put Pilate under pressure. So they threaten to tell Caesar that Pilate's not working for the Roman Empire. Therefore, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out, sat him down on the judgment seat, called at that place the pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Again, more terms to indicate the praetorium. The pavement, or Gabbatha, means a stone or a courtyard. Took him out into the stone courtyard, which both the fortress of Antonia and Herod's palace have. So let's see if we can continue to figure out where they're at. Now it was the day of the preparation for the Passover. Remember at Passover they get to release a prisoner. The Jews get a prisoner released from the Romans. It was about the 6th hour, And he said to the Jews, behold your king. Pilate says to the Jews, look, this is your king. Do with him what you want. So they cried out, away with him, crucify him. And Pilate, and you got to know this is a mocking statement. Shall I crucify your king? This is the guy that you're calling king of the Jews. You want me to kill your king? And the chief priest answered and said, we have no king but Caesar. Can you imagine what's going on in the spiritual realm when the spiritual leader of the Jewish nation is saying, Caesar is our king? Caesar is our king. They didn't even say we have no king but God. Caesar is our king. So Pilate takes the predestined but cowardice way out and says, what do you want? What do you want me to do here? They say, kill him. And the other Gospels talk about the fact that at this point he just washes his hands and says, he's yours. Verse 16. So he, Pilate, handed him over to them to be crucified. In other words, the Roman leader just said, this man can be crucified. They have the permission they're looking for, so now it's time to crucify him, keeping in mind this is all a predetermined plan of God. So they took Jesus, therefore, and he went out bearing his cross to the place of the skull, which in Hebrew is called Golgotha. Now this opens up a whole nother historical question mark. Just like we had one between Herod's palace and the fortress of Antonia, and which one's the Praetorium. When you go to Jerusalem today, there are two sites that they believe could be Golgotha. One is in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and the claim was that that location was outside of the city, and typically when they did crucifixions, they did the crucifixion along the main road into the city so that everybody could see that they were conducting a crucifixion and this was a criminal, kind of a scare tactic, if you will. And so on the west side of the city is today where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is. At that time, they say it was just outside the gates. There was a crucifixion site with a cemetery nearby. Now, quite honestly, if you look at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the distance between the Golgotha crucifixion and the tomb itself is maybe 100 yards, maybe 150 yards. So it's really close by. The second location is called the Garden Tomb. It is on the north side of the city. It is outside the city walls. For any crucifixion site to be considered legitimate, has to be outside the city walls. They don't do crucifixions inside the city walls. So outside the city walls to the north was a rock face that had what looked to be a skull in it. Now there's plenty of debate as to whether that skull face was there in the first century or just developed, because it's already eroding in the time since they've taken pictures 100 years ago and shown the erosion and said there's probably no way it could look that way back then. But both of these sites have all of the components you need to fit the biblical description. The Garden Tomb has the crucifixion site, and the tomb is literally about 150 yards away. And it is in this row of rock ledge that goes. You've got the face here. There was a road that came into the north entrance, actually the main thoroughfare of Jerusalem, which builds the argument for the Garden Tomb. The main thoroughfare ran north and south. And so this road came into the north side at the Damascus Gate. You've got the face of the skull. You've got a tomb very nearby. It said it was owned by Joseph of Arimathea, who also had a vineyard. There is a wine press near that tomb. There is a large cistern underground. So every component biblically is there. The debate is just, was that tomb there at that time? Obviously the rock face was. They could probably identify the cistern and the wine press as being of the right time frame. So historically, if you go back all the way to Constantine, Helen, his mother, gone through the Jerusalem trying to identify sites, has identified the site where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is. It has been destroyed and rebuilt. That site has many times. Church built over it, that torn down, a temple built over it, that temple torn down, a church built back. So they're digging way down, they're finding these locations. And the vast majority of historians believe the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is the actual site. The Garden Tomb is probably known more as the Protestant site, discovered in the 1800s. Ron Wyatt researched it and said it was it. So there's a lot of evidence and saying it was it. Maybe it's the right site, but the tomb is not the right tomb. Don't know. But there's plenty of debate to go around, and I don't know if it's critical to know which one it was. We know he was crucified. We know he was put in a tomb. 18. There they crucified him at Golgotha with two other men, one on each side, and Jesus in between. Pilate also wrote the inscription and put it on the cross. It was written, Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews. That's what Pilate put on there. This is Jesus the Nazarene, who is the King of the Jews. Therefore, many of the Jews read this inscription, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. He wrote that in 3 different languages and mounted it on the cross. So the chief priest of the Jews were saying to Pilate, don't write that he's the King of the Jews. But he said, but that he said he was the King of the Jews. You understand what they're doing? They're coming and saying, Pilate, don't put up there that he was the King of the Jews. Put up there that he said he was the King of the Jews. That way the Jewish people will know why we're crucifying him, because he said he was the King of the Jews. Pilate answered and said, what I've written, I've written. Like, I've had enough. I've agreed. You guys are crucifying him. I wasn't for this. I put a sign up there. I'm not going to go waste my time pulling the sign down and changing it. Pilate doesn't care anymore. Verse 23. Then the soldiers, when they had crucified Jesus, took his outer garments and made 4 parts, a part for every soldier, and also his tunic. Wow, you're about to see how important words are. Now the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece. I'm right back to where I'm telling you everything that's in there is important. It says that after he was crucified, the outer garments were made into 4 parts so everyone could have one, and also the tunic that he was wearing. But it tells you the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece. Why? Why would we need to know? Why would we need to know 2,000 years later that the tunic that he wore was one piece? It was woven into one piece. Because every word is in there for a reason. Psalm 22:18. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. So that prophecy is fulfilled. They divided his garments. Other scriptures tell us they cast lots for them and they took him. But when you look at the tunic was seamless. Why? Why was it important that the tunic was seamless? Because if you go back into Exodus 28 and 29, listen close. The high priest's tunic had to be seamless. It had to be woven as one piece. It has a hole for the head, it has holes for the arms, but the rest of it is one seamless piece. Are you getting the picture? Jesus was wearing the tunic of a high priest. Come on, you got to go into the book of Hebrews. He is our high priest, the one who makes sacrifices for the atonement of man. That's why this scripture is telling you that the tunic he had was seamless, because the high priest tunic was seamless. Every word means something. Don't miss them. Dig into them. Find out why they're there. Ask yourself the question, why do I need to know that? Why do I need to know that his tunic was seamless? What in the world could be the point of that? It's in there for a reason. And if you go do the research, you will find fascinating mysteries. It was an indication that they just crucified the high priest. We'll cover that when we get to Hebrews, that Jesus was our high priest. Thanks for joining me today. We'll see you next time on The Reveal.